I think it's a very useful way to clear the field of terminology by just saying Nick Fuentes says he's on quote Team Hitler, and he is a neo-Nazi. He is a pretty virulent anti-Semite and racist and misogynist. No, he says women want to be raped, all of that kind of stuff. Sort of Andrew Tate without the charm. And Tucker had him on his show and basically just gave him a massive softball interview where he pushed back on almost nothing. And that it's caused a huge fight on the American right about whether or not you should consider, basically it boils down to, should neo-Nazis and racists be allowed in the big tent? And should you criticize people or ostracize people who think?
Jonah Goldberg is editor-in-chief of The Dispatch. He's a fellow of the American Enterprise Institute, a public policy think tank, and I asked him to come on to discuss my next item because it's about an article I've written in the Times about what I termed the woke right, having noticed that term in use in the United States. It was prompted by the row on the US right that burst into the open when someone called Tucker Carlson interviewed someone else called Nick Fuentes. And so I wanted Jonah to come on and start by telling me who on earth these people are.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure.
I'd be surprised if a lot of your listeners had never heard of Tucker Carlson. He's a guy I've known for 30 years. He was a Fox News host, very popular. He's been on a bit of a journey, one might say. And when he was fired from Fox News, he launched an online operation, and he has become increasingly conspiratorial, indulging in lots of strange stories, demonology, UFOs, chemtrails, and he has been platforming more and more people who are I would argue anti-American, but definitely anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. He did a famous interview with a sort of self-taught kind of crackpot historian who said that Winston Churchill was the biggest villain of World War II and that World War II was a mistake, and England made a terrible mistake not allying, making peace with Hitler very early, all that kind of stuff. And then recently, Tucker outdid himself by having someone named Nick Fuentes on, who I agree most of your listeners probably never heard of. Nick Fuentes, people struggle because they want to be polite about what to call him. Is he a white nationalist? Is he a white supremacist? Is he this? Is he that? I think it's a very useful way to clear the field of terminology by just saying Nick Fuentes says he's on quote Team Hitler, and he is a neo-Nazi. He is a pretty virulent anti-Semite and racist and misogynist. No, he says women want to be raped, all of that kind of stuff. Sort of Andrew Tate without the charm, and Tucker had him on his show and basically just gave him a massive softball interview where he pushed back on almost nothing, and that it's caused a huge fight on the American right about whether or not you should consider, basically it boils down to, should neo-Nazis and racists be allowed in the big tent? And should you criticize people or ostracize people who think they should be, right? It's not so much
There seems to
people
be quite a
running
lot
to
of
the
people.
defense of the Nazis.
I mean,
I'm sorry?
the reason I wrote my own article is there seem to be quite a lot of people who think they should be, and notably, JD Vance, the vice president, has not said anything about this row, despite the fact that it's broken out in some of America's biggest conservative institutions like the Heritage Foundation, a row about whether or not it's reasonable for someone like Tucker Carlson to do softball interview with someone like Nick Fuentes, and whether either of them then belong in the tent. Why do you think JD Vance has stayed quiet, and does that mean, people like Nick Fuentes are actually winning?
Well, certainly on Nick Fuentes's scorecard, he thinks he's winning, and he's right. He was extremely obscure, largely an online phenomenon, and now he has been thrust into a much higher level of prominence and recognition. As far as JD Vance, there are two reasons why JD Vance is behaving the way he is. The first is that he's deeply indebted to Tucker Carlson, who personally lobbied to get Vance the job of vice president. All of the reporting, which no one has contradicted, from Maggie Hamerman and others at the New York Times, was that Trump was going to pick Marco Rubio or Doug Burgum, the governor from South Dakota. And at the last minute, the Trump sons and Tucker lobbied intensely and said you had to pick JD Vance. So JD Vance owes him. Secondly, JD Vance has a theory of the case, which says that racist, uh, uh, racist adjacent, very online, young, alienated men that Fuentes is popular with, that Tucker is popular with, are part of his core constituency. And so he runs interference for these people all the time. So this Nick Fuentes guy openly and racistly attacked Vance as a race traitor and attacked his Asian wife with racial epithets. And Vance said nothing. But when people have criticized young Republicans who make jokes about Auschwitz and Nazis and all of that, he rushes to their defense. I'm not sure that Vance's theory about the future of the GOP or the future of the Republican Party is correct, but it's worrisome enough that he thinks it's correct, that he thinks that this constituency of what people call heritage Americans, if you don't have an ancestor who fought in the Civil War or earlier, then you're not fully American. He thinks that is his core constituency, and he's catering to it.
So the big issue that earlier you said is this anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, and obviously those are different things.
Sure.
Nick Fuentes is definitely anti-Semitic because he talks about Jews very openly. Tucker Carlson, it's a more subtle thing, and he definitely has a policy disagreement. So his policy disagreement is he thinks that America is involved in foreign wars which have no conceivable interest to the United States, which he appears to include World War II actually in that, but he definitely thinks it's true of more recent wars where it's a more arguable case. And I suppose part of that argument is Israel that's pulling, and pro-Israel people who are pulling into America into wars that are in Israel's interest but not in America's interest. Is that a fair statement of the case? And how widespread is that view now? Because that would be definitely a big departure in the traditional Reaganite policy of the right.
There is definitely a growing anti-Israel sentiment among young people on the left and the right. Right? I would say it's still a much bigger issue in terms of voters on the left and in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. A lot of this anti-Israel stuff doesn't really show up in polling. And while I agree with you that Tucker has a fairly classical Buchananite isolationist argument
what is
about foreign policy, Pat Buchanan was a sort of an isolationist frontrunner in the 1990s and 2000s. He ran for president as an independent. We don't have to get too deep in the weeds.
Yeah.
Sure. And then so he's definitely got a fairly traditional isolationist view of foreign policy. I would argue that, and I agree with you, that you can be anti-Israel and not anti-Semitic. I think we've sort of passed the point now of debating whether or not Tucker Carlson is also anti-Semitic. When you're platforming Nazis, when you are going out of your way, at Charlie Kirk, this young conservative activist who was assassinated, at his funeral, Tucker, at his eulogy, did a pretty obvious dog whistle about how a bunch of guys sitting around eating hummus, that was this phrase, that was the image he conjured, plotted to murder Jesus Christ. He knows what he's doing. He knows why he's doing it. And the coding is so transparent at this point that I understand there are people who have a principled, serious intellectual argument about criticism of Israel and America's relationship with it. But Tucker Carlson isn't helping you if you want to make the argument that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel are different things, because Tucker Carlson is definitely playing with both.
So I can see that it's roiling the right in the United States. One final question. Do I need to fear that will come here?
Yes. Look, when you talk about the woke right, this is one of these things that you've been writing about, is that the problem, the reason why the woke right can look like the woke left is that both are illiberal. Once you embrace illiberalism, once you no longer believe in the sort of foundational notions of individual liberty, of protections from the state and intrusion, when you just care about power for your team, you end up looking, it ends up, both brown shirts and red shirts are illiberal goons. And they have different flavors and they support slightly different things, but their techniques and their goals are remarkably similar. And the British online right is very, very online, like the American right is, and it's becoming very, very illiberal. And once you're illiberal, the differences between the illiberal left and the illiberal right, they're interesting, they're culturally rich, but in terms of their threats to the decency of Western civilization, they're pretty much equal.
Well, Jonah Goldberg, Editor-in-Chief of The Dispatch, Fellow of the American Enterprise Institute, thank you so much for joining me and explaining that. I fear it may not be the last time we hear that phrase, the woke right.